Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. On the origins of hydrophobia at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1978, Edward O. Wilson, now famous as a founder of the new and controversial science of sociobiology, stood up before the podium. As the scientist was about to speak, about 10 people rushed up to him chanting, "Racist Wilson, you can't hide, we charge you with genocide." While some occupied the microphone denouncing sociobiology, others proceeded to pour a pitcher of ice-cold water on his head, proclaiming, "Wilson, you are all wet." Such are the origins of hydrophobia. People are not born with this fear of water. It is an acquired condition. What I call hydrophobia is fear of the public and political consequences of relating the findings of sociobiology to the human, and especially political, world. Public reception of Wilson's sociobiology. The new synthesis was rife with controversy from the very beginning. The initial storm centered obsessively on the very last chapter, the chapter in which Wilson applied his science to the question, what is man? It was not the mating strategies of the Hercules beetle or even the caste systems of some ant species that spawned these uproars. The furor over that last chapter suggests that humans are disposed to special concern for their own kind. One of the leading anti-sociobiologists was Wilson's colleague at Harvard, Stephen Jay Gould. While he advanced scientifically based critiques of the new discipline, it was evident throughout the controversy that he objected on moral political grounds. Human sociobiology had alleged implications or connections with racism, sexism, Nazism, and conservative political causes generally. Yet, as John Alcock demonstrated over a quarter century later in The Triumph of Sociobiology, the most sweeping attacks on the discipline have not stood up to scientific scrutiny. Why, Gould later reflected, is this academic issue so delicate and explosive? 1373. That sociobiology is controversial should not be controversial. There is a rational way to understand the irrational rejection of the evidence for sociobiology on political moral grounds. The political origins of this condition of hydrophobia are directly related to the origin of the species of government called liberal democracy in the English-speaking world. Understanding the explosiveness of sociobiology within liberal democracy requires a sociobiological understanding of the revolution that launched liberal democracy itself. Wilson's scientific inquiries were politically underwritten by the Western values of free inquiry posited by earlier Enlightenment thinkers. He defended himself on the basis of principles of freedom of speech that came out of the Enlightenment project of rationalizing politics. Yet the political innovations of 1776 and 1789 were based on their own new answer to the old question, what is man? What happened to the question, what is man? In the next century was recounted by zoologist G.G. Simpson. The point I want to make now is that all attempts to answer that question before 1859 are worthless and that we will be better off if we ignore them completely. 137 Biologist Richard Dawkins fully defended the substance of Simpson's remarks, adding, there is such a thing as being just plain wrong, and that is what, before 1859, all answers to those questions were. 1375. The empirical success of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution shattered old beliefs and demolished prior assumptions about human nature. Evolution redefined understanding of the nature and origins of the human as one branch on an ancient and manifold tree of life. And Darwin's theory continued to evolve. Altruistic or self-sacrificing behavior, which at first glance seems to refute Darwin's theory, has become comprehensible within its scope. British evolutionary biologist William Donald Hamilton, b. 1936, was one of the leading figures in the neo-Darwinian synthesis, the attempt to reconcile natural selection with developments in genetics. In 1964 he began publishing papers that offered a cogent explanation of altruistic behavior in Darwinistic terms. The theory was called kin selection. It stated that altruistic behaviors could evolve when the recipients of altruistic behavior are close genetic relatives. Since such altruism can propagate the altruist's own genes, such behavior is not contrary to the survival of the fittest. When defined as success in genetic propagation, fitness can be served by such altruistic behavior. Inclusive fitness. Altruistic behavior was thus explainable in concordance with Darwin's general theory of evolution. Hamilton's theories formed a pillar of the new science of social behavior that coalesced in Wilson's sociobiology. The theory of inclusive fitness implicated a genetic basis for behaviors connected with racism and xenophobia. The science soon yielded detailed explanations for the genetically adaptive basis of sex-gender differences, sexual jealousy, abuse of stepchildren, and rape. Despite these charms, anti-racists, feminists, and other advocates of a more equal society usually found sociobiology utterly anathema, if not evil. If the basic methodology of sociobiology were wrong, then a sociological explanation of the sociobiological controversy would be adequate. If the basic methodology of sociobiology were right, however, then only a sociobiological explanation of the opposition to sociobiology would be adequate. A qualified yet unmistakable pattern emerged among the most vociferous anti-sociobiologists. Stephen Jay Gould, R. C. Lewontin, S. Rose, L. Kamen, and J. Hirsch were among these leading critics of sociobiology. All are of Jewish descent. The strong correlation of ethnicity and Weltanschauung has a remarkable early 20th century parallel in early 20th century psychology. Jung was one of Freud's most promising disciples and, for a time, heir apparent of Vienna-based psychoanalytic movement. Jung and his Zurich-based group, however, began to stray from Freud and his views. They began to stress organic, ancestral impulses over individual memories. Jung eventually arrived at the view that religious needs have a biological basis. They are now doubting the influence of infantile complexes and are at the point of already appealing to racial differences in order to explain that theoretical disparity. Freud complained to Schunder Ferenczi on July 28, 1912. Jung must now be in florid neurosis. However, this turns out, my intention of amalgamating Jews and Goyim in the service of psychoanalysis seems now to have gone awry. They are separating like oil and water. 1377. This period marks the beginning of what historian of psychoanalysis wrote the conflict with Jung led Freud and reflect on the universality and objectivity of science, an issue that is as neglected as it is relevant to a science of psychology. In a letter of June 8, 1913 to Schunder Ferenczi, Freud wrote on the matter of Semitism, "There are certainly great differences from the Aryan spirit. We can become convinced of that every day. Hence, there will surely be different worldviews and art here and there, but there should not be a particular Aryan or Jewish science. The results must be identical, and only their presentations may vary. Certainly my remark about the interpretation of dreams should be taken in this way. If these differences occur in conceptualizing the objective relations in science, then something is wrong. It was our desire not to interfere with their more distant worldview and religion, but we considered ours to be quite favorable for conducting science." You had heard that Jung had declared in America that psychoanalysis was not a science but a religion. That would certainly illuminate the whole difference. But there the Jewish spirit regretted not being able to join in. 1379. Jung disagreed. The result was the Aryan neo-pagan religious movement science of analytic psychology. The root of the conflict between Jung and Freud can be expressed succinctly enough in the following statement from Jung's letter to Swedish physician and psychoanalyst Paul Karl Bjerre on November 10, 1913, "Until now I was no anti-Semite, but now I'll become one, I believe." 1380. Can there be a universal science? If an evolutionary understanding of Homo sapiens reveals the existence of biologically based differences between certain ethnicities or races, this questions the idea that there exists a common human mind. If there is no common human mind, then there is no empirical foundation upon which to base an unqualified, universal human science. Many intellectuals resist biological explanations in favor of environmental explanations for an appreciable reason. Biological explanations directly implicate the limits of scientific objectivity. If the mind is hardwired in ways resistant to environmental influences, then the universal mind is called into question. For example, if Noam Chomsky's skill in comprehending the media is strongly related to his Jewish origins, the same skills found in the disproportionately Jewish media moguls and spin doctors he exposes, then this insight could shed light on both the capacity and limits of objectivity. Karl Marx is another classic illustration of a secular Jew of the left. A basic assumption of Marxism is that biological or racial factors are ultimately irrelevant. If Marxist theory posits that race does not matter, then of course it follows that Marx's own Jewish descent does not matter. There is therefore a self-reinforcing, conspicuous consistency underlying the nurturist assumptions of the Marxist Weltanschauung. Marxism and similar leftist views promote an analytical removal of biological factors from sociology. Sociobiology is characterized by exactly the opposite trend of introducing biological factors into sociology. A sociobiological analysis of Jewish behavior, however, reveals a pattern of removing, rejecting, or downplaying the role of biological factors in human behavior. This pattern is verified by the disproportionate rejection of sociobiology among persons of Jewish descent. Jews, born to learn, represent the paradox of biological beings correlated with an anti-biological viewpoint. Jews tend towards an analytic separation of the biological and the social that effectually fights the synthesis of sociobiology. This is less than surprising considering that Jews have historically been the victim of nations that have synthesized the biological and sociological on a political level. Nazism, for example, represented a synthesis of ingredients that had historically threatened Jewish survival. It is as if Jews fight sociobiological synthesis, and even indirectly support the fragmentation of consilient human knowledge. By keeping all of the pieces of the puzzle separated, the larger picture of genetic history does not catch up. Does this fight against this kind of sociobiological synthesis represent a kind of fight for existence? Jews evolved the idea of God and a God's eye view above humanity, and thus above biology. The Judeo-Christian conception of evil is strongly correlated with the radical implications of biological evolution, and especially the primary mechanism of biological evolution, natural selection, i.e. the death of the unfit, and artificial selection, i.e. Auschwitz. There seems to be a Jewish blind spot to a socio-biological interpretation of world history. Is a racial biological worldview the Achilles heel of the Jews? If it is true that we Jews, on the level of statistical generalization, tend to fight the socio-biological synthesis, then it follows that in order to understand ourselves, we must recognize this blind spot in ourselves. Perhaps I must conciliate a whole new science of polysociobiology just in order to observe some of our blind spots and describe why we resist this synthesis. Perhaps it is our blind spot for a reason, and to achieve Jewish self-enlightenment upon this blind spot is equivalent to willing the theoretical sociobiological death. This, in any case, is how I understand myself attempting to understand myself. To overcome this blind spot is to forge the scientific synthesis of politics, biology, and sociology that may be identical to a program of rational self-destruction.